Gaza is covering lower income children. I don't get it. It's we the people, not we the marketplace or the corporation. That's the difference in this election.
Thank you. We are going to continue now, and we're falling way behind, and so I have a deal for all of you. So that we can try to make up some ground, would you be willing to have 45-second responses and 15-second rebuttals so that we can cover more ground? Would you be all right with that?
It's okay with me.
And you, sir? Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about some foreign policy. Should the United States either participate in a military action or approve either overtly or tacitly in a military action by another country, for instance Israel, against Iran before that country develops the ability to use a nuclear weapon? And that question first goes to Mr. Sestak, and you have 45 seconds.
Yes, I've patrolled those lanes out there in the military. I've operated with them pre-Shah era as well as after the Ayatollah took over. War is the last thing you want to do. The military option, however, should never be taken off the table, but it should be on the back of the table. And before we put men and women into harm's way, we should try diplomatically by making it hurt, as I voted for sanctions on gasolines and others, to cut off, to make sure Iran does not, because it cannot be permitted to have a nuclear weapon.
But if it comes down to military action, would you do that to prevent Iran from getting a military?
It is the last option I would support. But yes, you would not take in these 45 seconds, I would not be against what is necessary in order to do it. But we are far from that period right now.
Mr. Toomey.
I think it's unacceptable for the United States to tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran. This is a very, very dangerous regime. It's a serious security threat to the United States, and it's an existential risk to our good friend and ally Israel. Joe and I have differed on this. I urged the toughest possible economic sanctions on Iran very early on. Joe refused to co-sponsor the legislation, voted for it in the end, but wouldn't put the pressure on that we needed. Instead, he aligned himself with that small, very extreme element of the House that is least friendly to Israel, in fact, in some ways hostile to Israel, and urged the administration to pressure the Israeli government to ease the blockade of Gaza. A very big mistake. We should not be pressuring the Israeli government to make security concessions. They'll make the concessions as they see fit for their own security.
As I said, truth is the first casualty. I arrived in Congress after head of Navy's anti-terrorism, and for all that period of time, they never placed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard on a terrorist list. And my efforts of shaping that legislation finally got convinced the Bush administration placed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard on the terrorist list so we could cut off their finances where they're funding Hamas and Hezbollah that we were opposed to in my terrorist
Mr. Toomey. You have 15 seconds of rebuttal.
Well, as I said, I think Joe has allied himself with an extremist element in the House. Speaking as he did to an organization that embraces Hamas, I think was extremely imprudent. Putting pressure on the Israeli government when you consider the enormous security risks that Israel incurs.
Thank you, sir.
It's a big mistake.
If you feel like you don't need to take your rebuttal, you'd be helping us by letting it go. George?
Mr. Chairman, let me ask you a question about Afghanistan, because the ground seems to be shifting there right now. We've learned that NATO troops are actually granting safe passage now to Taliban commanders they would otherwise kill or capture so they can have secret negotiations with the Afghan government. One of the ironies is that we're keeping them secret from our supposed allies in Pakistani intelligence. But my question is, would it be safe for U.S. forces to withdraw from Afghanistan if the Taliban is in positions of power, and would you consider that a victory?
Well, first of all, let me say I supported President Obama's decision to increase our troop level and to adopt the classic counterinsurgency approach in Afghanistan. I thought that was the right decision. It's a very difficult set of circumstances. But my view is that it's extremely dangerous for us to leave precipitously the danger that the Taliban would take over, perhaps host al-Qaeda once again, destabilize Pakistan, which is, after all, a nuclear power, was a great risk.
But what if it's a negotiated agreement that includes the Taliban?
If the Taliban is willing to surrender, if they are willing to give up their arms, if they are willing to renounce violence, if they are willing to accept a peaceful government in Kabul, then I think this could be the beginnings of a negotiated surrender, and if so, it would be worth pursuing that.
I was on the ground in Afghanistan early in that conflict. We were doing that war right. And then we went to that tragic misadventure in Iraq Congressman Toomey voted for that tore our national security fabric apart. We're no longer there in Southwest Asia, however, for Afghanistan, George. It spiraled too far downward. One reason we're there, to eradicate that safe haven for al-Qaeda in Pakistan. Because if it fails that nation, there are nuclear weapons and 2,000 trained scientists at the most radical of Islamic universities they received their training that built those weapons. And even if we get the nuclear weapons out, they'll remain with al-Qaeda. But I've asked this president for over 2 years, almost a year and a half, I guess. We need metrics. Because why we have finger pointing here, it's always about, do you measuring if you got a practical solution by measurements if we're being successful. We need to roll it up, but finding out first if we're being successful. We don't have those metrics.
Well, the thing that Joe has missed on this is the danger of imposing an arbitrary deadline that's too soon. The danger in doing that is that it encourages the indigenous population, the people we need to win over if we're going to win a classic counterinsurgency battle. It encourages them to wait it out because they know that the bad guys are still going to be there. I think we need to pursue this in the approach that General Petraeus has advocated. I have great confidence in his ability.
Mr. Sestak.
Again, truth is this casualty as he speaks. I have not supported that deadline at all. In fact, much as I wrote and supported President Clinton as his Director of Defense Policy, and we in the National Security Strategy said every conflict must have measurements and benchmarks to see if the costs are worth the gains. That's what we need to measure the strategy.
I think this is to you, Mr. Sestak. Yes. First, John Bolton, the UN ambassador under President Bush, has hinted that he may run for president, basically bringing more attention to national security.
He said what for president?
He's thinking of running for president to bring more attention, essentially, to national security issues, saying he doesn't really think the current administration is really serious about the threats that we do face. So what would you say is the nature of those threats, and what approach should the U.S. take?
The number one danger, as the head of the intelligence community said to us, actually, setting aside that we have to deal with al-Qaeda in the Middle East, is actually our economic security. China. My gosh, they hold so much of our reserves. If they dumped them on the stock, imagine what would happen. Remember, it really is a strong economy that undergirds our military, that undergirds our education, that undergirds our health system. So Congressman Toomey, when he says, buy American, is an unfortunate tendency. And when he says it's a gift to American consumers that China is illegally exporting its imports on us, and he has a tariff that he's opposed to stop them to do it, we have to get our economy going, and that's the number one issue for us.
And Joe thinks you do that by huge new tax increases, including taxes on consumer goods, including all kinds of taxes that he's already voted for. Joe's voted for all the bailouts, the nationalizing of whole industries, the staggering spending, the stimulus, cap and trade, card check, government-run health care. In each instance, Joe distanced himself from the mainstream of Congress and said these things should have gone further. I agree with Joe that the most important national security issue long-term is the economic viability of our country. We cannot have a recovery with the incredibly reckless policies that Joe Sestak is pursuing and advocating that we go even further. The deficits that he has voted for, $1.5 trillion a year, $3 trillion of new debt. When I was in the House, I was offering alternative budgets. I was trying to cut spending. I was trying to fight earmarks. I was trying to bring spending under control. Joe Sestak is going in the opposite direction.
Would you, gentlemen, be willing to forego with your rebuttals to this question?
Just a quick one. Sounds like my parrot at home, again and again, but offering no solutions, except the corporation, as he voted for, invest in a factory in China. Its profits are no longer taxed. He opposed when I voted against closing the loopholes for oil companies in Bermuda. And so that's the difference. He is for we, the corporations.
Mr.
Pretty
Toomey.
extreme.
Mr. Toomey.
Joe, it's so clear that Joe just doesn't understand this at all. You know, Pennsylvania has lots of great companies. Many of them operate overseas. I have friends who work at a company named Air Products. And overseas, they have facilities where they develop industrial gas.